I've titled this program "The Mark of Zora," and it's pretty obvious that we wouldn't be here at all even talking about big blocks because the Corvette would have died an early death. And let's just get started here, I guess. This is really who's bringing us together here today. If it wasn't for this man, none of us would be here talking about anything today. He was an experienced race car builder and driver long before he ever came to America and got to Chevrolet. He was a creative, hands-on engineer second to none. And specifically, this is really why we're here today, the big block engines. Well, in Zora's career, there was a lot of roadblocks, and you're looking at most of them right here. And this is Zora right here. And I'm sure he had just finished sketching something on a napkin and he's putting in his pocket. Because that's the kind of guy he was. His brain never shut down. In his career, he had a lot of help from his friends, and a couple of them are here on the distinguished panel today. And he had hundreds of more friends at Tonawanda that put their heart and soul into building the big blocks. It wasn't a normal engine assembly line by any stretch of the imagination. The St. Louis Corvette plant wasn't a typical Chevrolet assembly plant. The people there knew exactly what they were doing and put every ounce of energy they had into it. And the same thing was true on the big block engine line. It was completely different from any other engine line that I ever worked on in 40 years of my career. Specifically, though, by the time the Corvette came out with the 396 and 65, I mean, it wasn't supposed to be a 396. It was clearly supposed to be a 427. But that engine didn't just appear in the 60s. It was an 11-year journey, an arduous journey for Zora. And that's what I'm going to start to cover to set the stage for the big block. Corvette debuted January 16, 53 at the Waldorf Astoria, and Zora Duntov was there. Thomas Keating, who was the general manager that day, said in the press, the car has been named the Corvette. Plans for production of this car are 6 months to a year away. It almost went to market with the U.S. flag in the emblem, and that was a last-minute catch by GM Legal. Well, little did Zora know it, but on January 19th, just 3 days later, the very first Opel Corvette was completed at a secret facility in Flint. Chevrolet's number on that car was 856. That was literally the only drivable test car to launch the entire Corvette program. It would become Zora's first Corvette later on. Well, Zora was so motivated, he sent a letter to Ed Cole. Cole passed it to Maurice Ollie, who interviewed and made an offer to hire Zora, and he started at the Chevy Engineering Center on May 1st, 1953, reporting to Maurice Ollie. With only 30 days on the job, he asked for a leave of absence to go to Le Mans. I don't know what he was thinking, but obviously Ollie declined that, and Zora then was AWOL and went anyway. He pretty much said in Jerry Burton's book that he didn't expect to come back to Chevrolet. He didn't think they would take him back. But he did. There were some strange circumstances. They did. He took his whipping and soldiered on. This, we are told, is June 30th, 1953. It was actually Monday, June 29th, 1953. It was all staged the day before. But no Chevrolet executives were here on either day, either on the 29th or the 30th. And certainly Zora wasn't there either. The first car to come off the line was actually number 3, and that didn't come off the line until July 7th. 2 days later, Corvette, first Corvette we looked at, built back in January, was now 6 months old. It was the only Corvette development car, and all the letters pretty much said the car was toasted. And specifically, there was one noise complaint due to the triple carburation system. And that was Zora's first foray into the Corvette. You can see he's copied on the end of the letter by this W.S. Wolfram, who pretty much ran the Corvette program. So this is Zora's entry into the Corvette, was to solve the noise issue with the induction system. July 28, 1953, he writes his very first private letter to Ed Cole. And he would write many, many private letters. He's only been on the job 89 days, and 1 month of that was in France. But in this letter, he proposed a super Corvette. His words, super Corvette for 1953. And he was going to do that by putting Cadillac reciprocating parts in a small block 265 cubic inch Chevrolet. And Zora had designed a dual plane intake with a single 4-barrel, and this engine will crank out 323 horsepower at 6,300 RPM and 270 foot-pounds of torque. He also suggested that they use extensive light metals, both in the engine and in some of the chassis components. And he said, quote unquote, this car will be capable of spectacular feats. What didn't happen? We all know it didn't happen. But that was his vision with less than 90 days at Chevrolet. Then on September 25th, he penned another letter to Cole, the company, and the Corvette L6 was a noisy engine. And he had some very elegant solutions to multi-cylinder engine flow, namely his special intake manifold that he proposed for the Super Corvette. But Zora was not the performance engineer at Chevrolet. Maury Rose clearly was. Chevrolet held its very first management conference ever, where they brought all of Chevrolet management together at the Greenbrier in White Sulphur Springs, October 8th to 11th, 1953. And Maury Rose was the fellow the engineer for the Corvette that did these stunts. He was off-roading the Corvette, he was drag racing a small airplane that he was ahead of when the airplane actually got off the ground. Now, Zora was back with only 856 doing the exhaust change study on the back of the car. I've actually seen a very grainy color film of the car that was trailing him. This is actually a frame from that film, or from a black and white version of it. But later on, they had yarn hanging from all those pieces of tape. And at speed, Zora literally crawls out on the back trunk to see where the yarn's going. It's an incredible piece of film. Okay, so November 12th, that letter, the second letter that he wrote, he certainly raised some attention. And here he's clarifying his position to Ed Cole and Harry Barr. His whole purpose for doing that was to get the patent guys at GM to start looking at his solution. And he quotes that the principle of the single 4-barrel, his intake, is it's superior to multi-carburation systems due to the absence of pulsations in car backflow. But unfortunately, Chevy engineering was too well entrenched with the WCFPs for 1956. So he stayed at it, but it didn't go very far. But he did get some visibility, and he was asked to give a talk to the SAE in early 1954. So he practiced that speech at GMI in Flint, and here he is practicing it in the auditorium on November 25th, 1953. The whole point is he's starting to gain more stature in the organization. And here's his third letter, December 16th. This one's been published many times, Thoughts Pertaining to Youth Outriders and Chevrolet, but it's basically a different variation on this Super Corvette proposal without using the words from the Super Corvette. January 1954. He's already following the top secret fuel injection program. They're doing that with the Buick Nailhead, brand new Buick 53 Nailhead V8. Zora has all the paperwork in his file, and he annotates at the bottom of each paper that he receives what his feelings are on it, but he's pretty well immersed in the fuel injection. Now he's also driving Porsches over the Belgian blocks in the rain of all things at the proving ground. So his influence and his European thoughts are starting to take shape. In March of '54, pretty much everybody knew the Corvette was dead. This is a prototype 54 V8 photo. And because the Corvette was in such dire straits, they were thinking about doing not a complete new body, but a facelift for 55, which didn't happen. Then Zora writes this letter. He's spending a lot of time with car 856. And this is pretty interesting. He's already on the wavelength of what do we need to do in the Corvette to get more power to the ground and get it there efficiently and then put the handling into the car. So he's doing a lot of work on 856. Literally everything in this letter, even though this is March of '54, he doesn't get some of these items into the Corvette until he builds the 56 SR1, and it's fully content-wise all there when the 57 RPO 684 comes out. Specifically, the heavier stabilizer bar in the front, and the 2-degree aluminum tapered shims that we didn't see in the late 56. He had all this stuff on this car in 54. And you can see that when he copies the world on this, Ed Cole, Barr, Russ Sanders, E.J. Primo, Rosenberger, Rubley, and Wolfram, he's really communicating now at the very top of Chevrolet, and he's starting to gain some more stature. He worked for Maurice Ollie, and Ollie was an expert on the independent rear suspension. So they were talking about swing axles, front swing axles, rear axles. And here it is a year later now, Zora's planning on making the Le Mans into a Chevrolet business trip. How he did it, I don't know, but he literally, Chevrolet sent him to Le Mans in 54. When he was a consultant, he designed the Allard J2X rear suspension. So he's already got one independent rear suspension design under his belt. And it turns out that Ollie was a very outstanding mentor to Zora for his first year. They both shared this passion for an independent chassis suspension for both performance. So now he goes to Le Mans and he meets with Porsche. He meets with a company called Man Diesel, not because GM wanted to do diesels, but Man Diesel had a special finish on their pistons that they thought would help the racing pistons in GM. Then he visited the tech center in August when he came back, looking at GM's new closed brake system, more on the Man Diesel, the Buick fuel injection, plating of pistons that Molly was doing, and the Buick XP100 special car. That's a picture of him with the Prince of Sweden, Prince Burl, who used to come to GM every year in August shutdown to buy a show car and take it back to Sweden with him. And there's John Dolza on the left as well. Okay, so we said before the Corvette was in pretty dire straits. Here he writes another secret letter just to Ed Cole and Maurice Ollie. And he's basically speaking out of tune, and he says, quote, "By the looks of it, the Corvette is on the way out. It is an admission of failure. It failed because it did not meet GM standards of a product. It did not have value for the money. The 6-cylinder engine was no better than a medium-priced family car. We have all those road tests to prove that. It out-accelerated the Corvette, out-handled it. So the timing was also unfortunate. When people wanted it, we didn't have the product to sell. And when we did have it, you know how we advertised it? Now anybody can have one. So we didn't even advertise it as an exclusive. This is where he starts to lobby for a dedicated Corvette organization to stave off its death. He calls it an organization which will eat and sleep Corvette as their divisions eat and sleep their particular cars. And the Corvette dodges the bullet, and he's charged with putting more performance, and he's actually looking at buying 4-speeds from European companies. Then a strange thing happens April 1st, 55. Zora's banished to the proving ground to work on truck brakes. And Ed Cole told everybody, look, he might come back someday. So while he's gone, while he's doing his penance, keep copying him on everything that's going on so he doesn't lose track of what's going on. He's going to be over there for a while working on the truck brakes. Well, where was he really? He wasn't even at the proving ground. This is the April 5th top secret fuel injection report. And if you look, right, number 3, Duntov, working on acceleration and enrichment. Duntov, working on the economizer car buildup. He's working directly for John Dolza. He's an employee of GM Research and Development. He's no longer an employee of Chevrolet. But if anybody in the outside world finds out where he is, the GM fuel injection cat is out of the bag. That's why the cover story of sending him over to the proving ground. Writes another secret report to Ed Cole. Not there 2 weeks. And I'm not going to show it off to you, but it's absolutely an amazing report. Zora wasn't one just to criticize without having a solution. He hand-typed the 7-page letter at home, and he left spaces where he could sketch in all the things he said were deficiencies in fuel injection, and all the things he said could improve upon it. He said that his feelings are that the system is remarkably good, having operated as it did with so many things off-key. That's page 7. Well, he's writing letters. Here's another. This clearly states he's on the payroll for engineering staff. He's copied right under Dolza with all of Dolza's other staff people. When you come down to B, where it says Mercedes test, Mr. Duntov is responsible for the Mercedes 300 SLs. John Dole's son told me about these two cars. His dad used to bring them home, and they used to race them up and down Woodward. And it was a nice story, and it's kind of in my book, but then I found this photo. This photo was in Zora's personal file. It was one of his most cherished photos. It was taken by GM April 18th, 1955. And you can see they didn't watch that car very long because he never got out of it. Then he writes another letter to Ed Cole, and he's again trying to get Cole to make an exclusive Corvette organization. And he's telling him in this letter here about the fuel injection. And he says, okay, now we're going to continue with the old GM fuel injection, but by the way, they are going to develop what was all of his recommendations into a secondary system based on the mass airflow control. And he included this sketch to explain to Ed how that fuel injection was going to be set up. Again, now for the second time, he turns his trip to Le Mans in 1955 into another business paid trip, and he actually wins his class. Unfortunately, though, there was a serious accident there where Pierre Levay was killed when his Mercedes overtook a slower car and launched him into the crowd. His co-driver was John Fitch. As a result of the accident, Mercedes pulled out of racing for 30 years. But more importantly, you know, there's two old adages that I like. One says, journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And the second one is, when you look back at something in retrospective, and there's 1,000 different things that had to happen. Any one of those things, had they been different, the outcome wouldn't be the same. And this is one of those steps. It's an unfortunate accident, but John Fitch was the co-driver. When Mercedes pulled out, it made John Fitch available to help Chevrolet. And if it wouldn't have been for that accident, I don't think that would have happened. So, again, he turned it into a business trip, and he was still researching outsourcing of four-speed transmissions. Now he writes another private letter on engineering staff letterhead to Ed Cole. And he says, you know, I'm still running over this whole Corvette situation. I proposed you entrust me with the charge of the Corvette. Ed didn't. No, Zora had too many other things on his plate. September 13, 55, he raised up Pikes Peak in a dual quad 56 Chevy. That's pretty well known. I drove some prototype 97 Corvettes that were back in 95. You know, we had the camouflage on them, and I did the road trip up Pikes Peak for the engine development. And I can tell you, I was scared to death driving up that road at normal speed. I can't imagine racing up the road. And in this lower picture on the right is George Escobar. He was a special tune-up guy, one of the UAW guys at the Tech Center in Detroit, who was a tune-up expert, and he and Zora had a great relationship. He was always accompanying him on all of his car projects, as you'll see. And mysteriously, there's George at the 1953 Corvette Wolf. I still haven't figured out why he was a plant there, but that's remains to be seen. So Zora now is still working on fuel injection. It's his idea to put the ram pipe aspect in it. So this was his letter to Max Wrench, suggesting and then telling him how to determine what those fuel injection lengths would be. Zora really thought fuel injection was going to be a better application than the carburetor, so he kind of shelved his idea from 53, and now he's really putting all of his efforts into fuel injection. But he needed a camshaft, and everybody knows there's this thing called the Duntov camshaft. Well, Zora typed this rise and run information on his typewriter at home, and that was in October 20th of 1955. That's what the specifications to grind the first experimental Duntov cam, but it wasn't called a Duntov cam. And Duntov never took credit for designing that cam. The real designer was this guy here, Alessandro Anzani. And Anzani was a real old Italian guy. He was way older, but see, Zora raced motorcycles and cars against him in Europe, knew him, learned of the camshaft design, wasn't into designing camshafts, but he put all the information in here. and he pulled it back out years later when he had an application for it at Chevrolet. And Anzami's the guy, by the way, that patented the radial aircraft engine and made absolute millions of dollars during World War I. And then he retired, and that's when he started doing his motorcycle racing and car racing. Then Zora writes another epistle to Ed Cole, and this is explaining to Ed Cole how the SCCA works and how the FIA works, and what a modified sports car is and a production sports car and an unlimited sports car. And he brings up the name specifically Briggs Cunningham as an example. So he's setting all these seeds in place. Then Zora gets his first real car that he can really play with. He's taken the old project car, 5951, it's a 55 Corvette. Now he's reusing it for his purposes, and this is his work order to apply all the Corvette heavy-duty RPOs and hold this open until the project's done. Now he really has a test platform to put all those things that he formulated back in 53 and 54 into place. So then he has to take that car out to Phoenix. He's going to try to break the speed record at Daytona on the beach. He's going to try to do that in January and February. But he knows he has to hit 155 miles an hour out in Arizona because of the wheel slippage on the sand in Daytona to net 150. And he takes his favorite carburation man with him, and they go out there. And on November 30th, they're joined by Ed Cole, Harry Barr, Russ Sanders, McKenzie, Maury Rose. And along with that group comes Briggs Cunningham and John Fitch. And Cole is making a pitch to Cunningham and Fitch to get involved and do a 56 Sebring race team with the Corvette. And Zora demonstrates that car on the track to both Fitch and Cunningham. And then on December 13th, 1955, he actually hits 155.2 miles per hour in this particular car that already has 10,000 miles on it. And in this picture, Zora is wearing his favorite white crew neck shirt, and he's still wearing it here. Now this photo's been published many times claiming this is Zora over at the proving ground doing his penance on the truck brakes. Nobody ever realized there was a palm tree over his shoulder, and you don't find palm trees in the Detroit area. But his two guys that always traveled with him were Ken Eberling on the left and George Escobar. And again, George, what he was doing at the 1953 stage rollout, I still don't know that one. But the Daytona Beach program starts to take shape. Maury Rose is officially overseeing it. Zora has so many other things on his plate. December 15th, Zora is still out in Arizona, and he sends his telex back that now we're going to need 4 cars for Sebring. He gets his car ready, and this picture was taken on January 15th, 56, when he tried to set the record at Daytona, and he still had the wing on the car, or had the thin headrest behind him, but that was too much aerodynamic drag. And coincidentally, he's still working on fuel injection. He comes up with the aluminum intake manifold. So he's working, no matter where he is, he's always working on a multitude of projects. Then on the next day, the 16th, he actually hit a two-way average of 150.583. But he did it without the headrest. And there's his wife, Elfie, congratulating him right after it. Then John Fitch signs on. He signs his contract in January of 56 for $12,000 for 1 year of consulting service. As we all know, in January, Speed Weeks, a demonstration, Betty Skelton, Zora, and John Fitch are in what's going to be 3 of these Sebring vehicles. We just don't know yet. That's a picture of Zora with that car on the beach. And then in February, he again takes another run at Ed Cole, believe it or not. And he starts explaining to Ed, how good the Corvette is and what they have to do, and still, you really ought to give me control of the Corvette. But he says he feels that the Corvette is pretty good as it is, but for racing it needs some additions. I believe that he gave this talk and wrote this letter for the 1956 SCCA convention hosted by Kaiser in Detroit. And then the 4 cars did go to the Sebring grid. That's the real McCoy car. very famous advertisement. The bottom line is, 4 Corvette team cars did make a respectable showing. Dick Thompson's 106 there in the bottom, won the SCCA championship for the Corvette in '56. But one of the unfortunate things that happened after the Mercedes accident, the American Automotive Manufacturers Association, that's the AAMA, held a board meeting on the 14th floor of the GM building. And of course, the big 4 top executives were there, and they agreed to erase the ban. And they knew it would take 6 months to put it into effect, so they set the date for June 15th, 1957, after that particular Sebring. But the die was cast, no more racing. The fuel injection that Zora actually did the design for came out on the Corvette. First one was built October 18th, 1956. And then we fast forward to the next SCCA convention in January of '57. And guess what? There's Briggs Cunningham and Jim Kimberly talking to Harry Barr looking at the Corvette SS. And there's Zora with a fuel-injected Corvette explaining the virtues of that. Then we fast forward again to Sebring. This is the culmination. This is everything they know goes into 2 Sebring race cars plus the Corvette SS. And bottom line was, Thompson finished first in number 4, and number 3 finished second, and Thompson again won the championship. So at this point in time, Zora's in. The Corvette is established, it's going to be here. Zora knows everything he needs to do to get us up to 1964, 65, except there's no sense generating 500 horsepower, okay, if the car doesn't handle it. You've got to deal with this nasty thing called gravity. He knows the chassis has to be stronger and lower. He knows for handling he's going to need independent rear suspension. He knows that to stop that much power we're going to have to improve the brakes, things like disc brakes. Also knows that the companies that make the wheels, the Halliburton wasn't the answer. He knows the company that makes wheels and tires have to have better technology. He knows that to generate the power you have to manage the air-fuel charge way better than they've ever done before. You got to look at the ignition, it has to be robust, the spark control, that technology has to be developed. And the overall power to weight, which means you got to have more alloys. And you better have some metallurgical breakthroughs and some cost breakthroughs. So this becomes Zora's game plan now, starting in '58 as the Corvette goes forward. But he was also in charge of high performance, so it was Zora that had to develop the W engine at 348 in 1959, and that GM was still on a multiple carburetor. So that was the first application for the 3 2-barrels. I did run across some earlier references to two crucial words called field test. But to give you an example of what that was, this is some of the paperwork to build the 1960 Corvette Le Mans engines, specifically for that program. And the word field test, Zora covered all the costs by saying, well, I'm going to field test these special Corvette engines. And there's a lot of paper to that effect, but that's where those code words come for field tests. It's basically racing. And then he's specifically improving those engines to go to Le Mans. They actually built them and tested them, and he drove them himself, the pre-test ones at Sebring. But Zora was also looking at, well, what rear axle ratios do we need for Sebring? How do we set the chassis up? Zora was also working on that. That's what you see his work on the right. Here's 2 letters, specifically on the field test engines for Le Mans. One by Mr. Davis here, and the other one from Fred Franke. Well, those 2 guys were both involved. I hope some of this will jog some of their memories here as we get into some discussion. Then the engine, of course, grew to 409 cubic inches. It was put in the NASCAR field by Chevrolet. Actually won the 1962 NASCAR championship. They did a lot of testing. Bob Cliff took a lot of 409s out to Mesa, Arizona, did some testing. Then there was the carburetor wars that came in. Rochester wanted to get in the carburetor business too. This is Zora's letter to McPherson talking about how we're going to get 327 and 409 improvements in performance, 11-to-1 compression ratios. That's what I said, where you got the pistons got to get better, the ring packs got to get better, all those things to make Zora was also real good at cutting red tape. He was real good at releasing racing components, these so-called heavy-duty service components, from layout drawings without having finished drawings. Saved a lot of time, knew how to work the system. He was also intimately involved in the chassis improvements. He'd been working on aluminum heads since 1957. A lot of setbacks, that's where a lot of technology in the aluminum casting had to be improved, and product design had to be improved to learn how. You don't pick a cast iron part and say, I'm going to make it out of aluminum. You got to design for the aluminum. That was one of the lessons learned. Talking about the ignition maturity, they had a lot of dual point distributors. They actually found out the dual point distributor didn't work. They've been racing it for about 3 years and it absolutely did not work. They didn't know that until one of the guys they had testing their 409s doing their field tests. They got the engine back and this guy forgot to pull his distributor out. He had changed the distributor to a single point. And he was the fastest of all the guys that was doing the field tests. So when his distributor came back with a single point, they asked him, and their final test showed that the field, the electromagnetic field at the high RPM, couldn't dissipate fast enough, so there was actually a detriment to it. And that's why in '62 they went away from the dual points. And then the high performance clutches started to fail, so that was another component that they had to learn and improve. But it was always more carbs. Zora just couldn't get past the fact that everybody else wanted 3 2s and 2 4s, so he's still fighting that battle. In the carburation advances, the Corvette went from side drafts with WCFBs to AFBs to Rochesters and finally to the Hollies that made all the power. Pistons and displacement increases were continual. The 409, in order to generate the horsepower they needed from NASCAR, they forecasted that the displacement had to go bigger. They were actually building 456 cubic inch prototypes. And the bottom end was failing, it just wasn't strong enough with the crankshaft. This is the first application of the service package. This was Zora's service package. He's telling McPherson about it. It's basically what he came up with on that 265 back in '53. This clearly said they had to hit 450 horsepower, and they needed to put some aluminum into the body, the Z11 front end, to get the weight ratio. Then here he's talking about whether or not they're going to have a web in the heavy-duty intake manifold. That's that little web and what it's there for, and what benefits you get by putting it in there versus taking it out when you're on in a race car. And he develops here this heavy-duty bill of materials, similar to what he had in 1953. Now they're really pushing forward on a 409 head. And then when we get up to September of '62, we're now talking about the new generation engine, the one we're all familiar with the advent of the Mark I and the Mark II, and what the displacements are, who's going to build it. Then Kyneth gets assigned to work on the Mark II version of it. Vince Pickens is also part of the system now, Chevrolet. Mark II is going to be specifically a 426.7 CID with Zora's single 4-barrel. He's finally got his little niche to put his intake manifold in the first 4-barrel on one of these. But at the same time, they're doing some double overhead cam 327s and some double overhead cam big blocks, 402 cubes at that point. Then the lightweight Corvette program comes in. This is talking specifically about the third one and when it's going to be ready for Zora to test drive it. And then it compares on the right-hand side the '64 Corvette to the mid-engine '66 that he's also working on at that time in the XP 782, so they're doing some future planning. Now we're up to December 8th, 1964. And again, this is Zora's first modern big block with his heavy-duty service package. So this pretty much establishes that. And he's also being told, oh, by the way, get the 65 to handle all that power. Let's get the heavy-duty suspension going. Let's get the rock crusher transmission going. Let's get the heavy-duty brakes going. So we have the entire package once the engine's ready. This is engine, they're going to build engine 90, this is work order 19450-3 specifically. And it says in the middle there's a Mark II and a Mark IV type engine and how it's going to be set up. And there's more on the right here about all the components for that engine when they're going to be ready. This is the actual engine. This is engine, it's stamped upper right hand corner. You can see it's stamped 19450-3. It's got a prototype housing on it, prototype intake manifold for the L88 package. As I said before, the 1965 Corvette was supposed to be a 427. There it is right at the bottom. Corvette 427 mechanical cam. It was going to be advertised at 450 horsepower, but the actual was 475. And that's without the heavy-duty package. This specifically says here, this is the valve latch specs for the dyno lab. There's a Bill Howell's name on the bottom of it. So you got the 396 mechanical cam. At this point in time, that was an L78. You've got the L72 as we know it, and then you got the L72 at the bottom with the surface package high performance. So they have all three engines in business. And then the ISO Revolta team that bought some Fuelie 327s for Le Mans in '64 from Chevrolet heard about the big lot. So they inquired through Bunky Knudsen, who was the head of Chevrolet, hey, can we buy some of these engines for 65? So Zora writes this letter back and says, oh yeah, I recommend the heavy-duty service package on the 396 with the rock crusher, with the radiator and core support. We all know that we had to have. And he says at the very bottom, oh, by the way, they're all available because they're in production. This is March 22nd, 1965. What we call the L88 was not called the L88 until about sometime in 66 to 1967. It was called a special heavy-duty service package. And it consisted of a special intake manifold, a single 4-barrel carburetor, special camshaft, special pistons and ring packs, intake and exhaust valves, push rods, bigger push rods, intake and exhaust valve springs, and a specially tuned harmonic balancer over and above 10 cycles per second more than the regular RPO 72. Then they built the first one. This is the picture of it in Grand Sport number 3, 327.65. It raced at Sebring. It was a field test for what we call the L88 Iron Head. That's it. That's the engine we have right here today. This is it back in the day. Let's see, this is more information on the L72 and the L72 special surface package. Matter of fact, there I got this dyno oil pressure versus engine speed chart from Darovich, who was the test operator, November 22nd, 1965. Up in the very top it says what the Tonawanda engine ID is, and it says RPO L88 star. You come down to the star, it says basic engine is L72 with the heavy duty service package. So they were still getting used to that terminology. This is another release. Now that they know, and I won't get into all the details of what the political decision was to put the 396 in for 65, but then they made the decision to go 427 to 66. And you can see at the very bottom here, the 66 L72 without the service package was good for 450 horsepower at 6,400 RPM and 465 foot-pounds at 4,000. And then down at the very bottom, you'll see the heavy-duty transmission and the rear axle assemblies. The heavy-duty for racing as you get with those. So that brings us up to this photo. There's Zora with Denny on the dynamometer. There is the 1967, what's called the Chevrolet Engineering Managerial Engine. Every single engine produced had a managerial engine that sat in one room so engineers could look down, see, feel, touch it. If you were in charge of engineering a brace and you wanted to change the brace, you'd go down there and you would make sure the brace worked here before you ever release the part and send it to St. Louis or to Tonawanda, as the case may be. And you can clearly see that it was rated at 425 horsepower. with the aluminum heads. And of course, the pinnacle was to replace the cylinder block with aluminum. And I know the paperwork says, oh yeah, it's an L88. When you order that, it's an L88 with aluminum block. But there was 27 other different components in the engine that facilitated the aluminum block. And that's the reason for the year delay that the engine had, because you couldn't just change the block to aluminum. You had to change all the other parts that work with it that reciprocated. So there was a lot of special parts that went in. That was part of the delay. But this is basically the block plus the rest of the service package that made it work. That's the end of the presentation. Now you can see that Zora had all those ideas, how the car had to mature, all the other technologies that had to develop to make what we're here to talk to this panel about. So I hope that gives everybody some background, frame of reference, jogs, some memories here.